Your services are no longer required." The words came from my brother's mouth, but they sounded like they'd been rehearsed, practiced, maybe even scripted by his wife, Denise, who stood behind him in the doorway of what had been our father's office, her arms crossed and a satisfied smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. I looked up from the accounting software where I'd been reconciling last month's invoices for Brennan and Sons Construction, the company my grandfather had started in 1962, the company my father had built into a multi-million-dollar operation, the company I'd kept financially solvent for 20 years without taking a single paycheck. "Excuse me?" I said, certain I'd misheard. My brother Derek shifted his weight, not quite meeting my eyes. "We're bringing in a professional accounting firm, someone with actual credentials. This is a real business now, not a family hobby. My name is Margaret Brennan. I'm 58 years old. For 2 decades, I've arrived at this office every Monday through Friday at 7:30 a.m. I've managed accounts payable and receivable, handled payroll for 43 employees, filed quarterly taxes, maintained relationships with 3 banks, and kept this company in the black through 2 recessions and countless industry downturns. I did all of this while my father was alive because he asked me to. Just until we get back on our feet, he'd said 20 years ago when the company hit a rough patch and he couldn't afford to pay both me and the outside accountant. The rough patch passed. I stayed, unpaid, because it was family. Derek, I've been doing the books here for 20 years. Every financial system, every bank relationship, every vendor agreement. And we appreciate that," Denise interrupted, stepping forward. Her red-soled heels clicked against the hardwood floor my father had installed 5 years ago. "But Derek is the owner now. Things are going to be run differently, more professionally. The funeral had been 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks since we'd buried our father. 3 weeks since Derek had inherited 100% of Brennan and Sons Construction. Despite the fact that I'd been working here just as long as he had. Despite the fact that Derek had spent the first 10 years after college bouncing between failed business ventures while I kept this company alive. Despite the fact that when Derek finally came back to work for Dad, it was me who trained him on the financial systems, me who covered for him when he disappeared on business trips that were actually golf weekends. "What about the ownership transition documents?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "The tax implications of the inheritance, the pending audit from the contractor's licensing board?" Derek waved his hand dismissively. "The new accounting firm will handle all that. I need you to have your personal items cleared out by end of business today." Today. He was giving me hours, not even days. "And the back pay?" The question came out quietly, but it landed in the room like a stone. Derek's expression shifted to confusion. "Back pay. For 20 years of work, Dad always said he'd make it right eventually, that when the business was more stable, he'd compensate me properly for—" "You worked here voluntarily," Denise cut in, her voice sharp. "There's no record of employment, no contract, no agreement for compensation. You can't just claim you're owed money because your father made vague promises." I looked at my brother, really looked at him. At 45, Derek had our father's build, but none of his character. Where Dad had been decisive and fair, Derek was weak and easily manipulated, and Denise had been manipulating him since the day they got married 8 years ago. "Derek," I said, Dad told me 100 times that I'd be taken care of, that my years here mattered, that when he was gone, if it mattered so much, it would have been in the will, Derek replied, but his voice wavered slightly. Look, Maggie, I'm sorry, but I have to think about the business now, about efficiency and professionalism. We can't keep running things like a family charity. A family charity. 20 years of 60-hour weeks. 20 years of skipped vacations because tax season couldn't wait. 20 years of watching every penny, negotiating with suppliers, managing cash flow during lean times. A charity. I'll need access to the files, I said finally, to finish the quarterly report that's due in 2 weeks, to brief the new accounting firm on the systems I built. Already handled, Denise said, pulling a set of keys from her designer purse. We changed the locks this morning and had IT disable your email access, security protocols. They'd planned this carefully, deliberately, before my father's body was even cold in the ground. I stood up slowly, looking around the office I'd occupied for 2 decades, the desk where I'd sat through countless late nights, the filing cabinets I'd organized and reorganized as the company grew, the window overlooking the construction yard where I'd watched this business expand from 3 trucks to 30. There's one thing you should know, I said quietly, gathering my purse. Every financial document, every contract, every piece of correspondence that matters to this company exists in 2 places. The servers here and my personal backup system. Derek paled slightly. That's proprietary information. You can't what? Protect myself after giving 20 years to a company that's now throwing me out like garbage? I smiled, though there was no warmth in it. Don't worry, Derek. I'm not going to sabotage you, but I'm also not going to make this easy. I walked past them both, out of the office, through the main floor, where employees who'd known me for years looked away uncomfortably. They'd probably been told this morning, warned not to talk to me, not to make a scene. In the parking lot, I sat in my car for a long moment, hands shaking on the steering wheel. Then, I pulled out my phone and made 3 calls. The first was to my daughter, Emma. Honey, I need the name of that employment lawyer you mentioned, the one who handles contract disputes. The second was to Martin Sullivan, the company's longtime insurance broker, who'd been dealing with me, not Derek, for 15 years. Martin, I need you to do me a favor. Don't renew any policies until you hear from me directly. The third was to Thomas Chang, the senior loan officer at First National Bank, where Brennan and Sons held a $2 million line of credit that I'd personally negotiated and maintained. Thomas, we need to talk. Today, if possible. As I drove away from the building, I thought about something my father had told me shortly before he died. We'd been in his hospital room, and he'd been drifting in and out of consciousness from the pain medication. The documents, he'd mumbled. In the safe. Make sure Derek doesn't. Make sure you. He'd never finished the sentence. I'd assumed he was confused from the medication. But now, I wondered, what documents? What safe? My father's personal attorney, Richard Moss, had read the will. Everything to Derek. Nothing to me except a brief mention. To my daughter Margaret, I leave my gratitude for her years of service. Gratitude. 20 years of unpaid labor reduced to gratitude. But my father had been a meticulous man, a planner. He wouldn't have left me with nothing after promising for 2 decades that I'd be compensated, unless something had changed, unless someone had influenced him in his final months when he was weak and vulnerable, unless Derek and Denise had made sure I was written out. I pulled into the parking lot of a coffee shop and opened my laptop. I'd been truthful when I told Derek that I had backups of everything. What I hadn't mentioned was exactly how comprehensive those backups were. Every email, every financial statement, every contract, 20 years of documentation, all time-stamped, all organized, all stored in 3 separate cloud accounts that only I could access, including some very interesting correspondence from the last 6 months, emails between Derek and several subcontractors, negotiating deals that somehow never made it into the official company books, invoices that showed payments to a consulting company that, upon investigation, was registered to Denise's maiden name. I'd noticed these discrepancies 3 months ago, right around the time my father's cancer had taken a turn for the worse. I'd been planning to discuss them with Dad when he felt better. Then he'd died, and Derek had moved so fast to take control that I'd been scrambling to keep up. Now, sitting in my car with my laptop open, I saw the pattern clearly. Derek and Denise had been siphoning money from the company for months. Not huge amounts, nothing that would trigger immediate red flags, but consistent, steady diversions of funds, maybe $50,000 over 6 months. Enough to matter, enough to be fraud. My phone rang. Emma. Mom, I talked to the lawyer. His name is James Rodriguez. He said he can see you tomorrow morning at 9. I gave him a brief overview, and he thinks you might have a case for quantum meruit. Basically, you can sue for the reasonable value of services rendered even without a written contract. Thank you, honey. Mom, are you okay? I know Uncle Derek can be difficult, but I didn't think he'd actually... I'm fine, I interrupted gently. Better than fine, actually. I think I'm finally seeing things clearly. After we hung up, I pulled up the contact information for Richard Moss, the attorney who'd read Dad's will. I'd assumed the will was straightforward, but maybe I'd assumed wrong. Richard, it's Margaret Brennan. I need to ask you something about my father's estate. Margaret, I'm so sorry about how the will turned out. I tried to talk to your father about making provisions for you, but he was insistent that the business go to Derek. When did he sign the final version? There was a pause. About 2 months before he passed. Derek brought him to my office. Said your father wanted to make some changes. 2 months before he died, when he was heavily medicated, when he could barely remember conversations from one day to the next. And was he alone with you when he signed? Another pause. Longer this time. Derek was in the room, and Denise. They said they were there to help him understand the documents since the medication made things fuzzy. I closed my eyes. Did my father seem confused? Margaret, I don't think... Richard, I'm asking as someone who knew my father for 40 years. Did he seem like himself when he signed that will? The silence stretched out. Finally, no, he didn't. He seemed unsure. He kept asking if this was what he'd told me to draft, and Derek kept reassuring him it was. I had concerns, but technically, he was mentally competent according to the medical evaluation Derek had provided. Medical evaluation that Derek had provided. How convenient. Richard, did my father ever mention a safe to you? Personal documents he wanted protected? He mentioned something about that, yes. Said he had kept certain papers in a safe at the house. Family documents, personal correspondence. He wanted to make sure you knew where it was, but Richard trailed off. He never gave me specifics. I assumed he'd tell you directly. The house, my childhood home, where my father had lived alone for the past decade since Mom died. The house that was also part of Derek's inheritance. One more question. Is there any way to challenge the will based on undue influence or diminished capacity? Richard hesitated. It's possible, but you'd need evidence. Medical records showing he wasn't competent. Testimony from people who witnessed Derek pressuring him. That kind of thing. It's an uphill battle and expensive. What if I told you I have documentation of Derek committing fraud against the company, siphoning funds, false invoicing, that sort of thing? Now, I had his full attention. That's a different matter entirely. That's criminal. If you have solid evidence, you should talk to both a criminal attorney and possibly the police. After we hung up, I sat in my car as the afternoon sun slanted through the windshield. 20 years. I'd given this company 20 years, and my brother had repaid me by stealing my inheritance and throwing me out like trash. But Derek had always been careless, sloppy. He'd relied on me to clean up his mistakes for so long that he'd probably never learned to cover his tracks properly. And I knew where every financial body was buried. My phone rang again. Thomas Chang from the bank. Margaret, I got your message. What's going on? Thomas, I need you to tell me about the status of the company's line of credit. Specifically, who has signature authority? Well, your father obviously, but since he passed, let me check the paperwork. I heard keyboard clicks. Okay, interesting. According to our records, both you and Derek have signature authority. That was set up about 5 years ago when your father restructured the credit line. Both of us. Derek probably didn't even know that. He'd been too busy with his business development golf trips to pay attention to the boring details of bank relationships. And if I were to request a freeze on the account pending an ownership dispute, more keyboard clicking. That's complicated. Technically, either signatory can request a freeze, but it would trigger a full review of the company's financial status. We'd have to examine all recent transactions to ensure there's no fraud or misappropriation of funds. Hypothetically, what would happen if such a review found irregularities? Thomas's voice became more cautious. We'd be required to report it, and we'd likely freeze all credit until the situation was resolved. Margaret, is there something I should know? Not yet, I said, but there might be soon. I'll be in touch. As I ended the call, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For 20 years, I'd been the dependable one, the one who fixed problems, who kept things running, who sacrificed her own interests for the family business. I'd been so busy being reliable that I'd never demanded what I was owed. That ended today. Derek thought he'd won by cutting me out. He thought that with me gone, he could run the company his way, with his wife pulling the strings. He thought I'd just disappear quietly, grateful for the years of experience I'd gained. He'd badly underestimated me. I drove to my father's house, Derek's house now, according to the will. But Derek and Denise hadn't moved in yet. They were still in their trendy downtown loft, probably planning how to flip the property for maximum profit. The house was empty, sad-looking. Dad's car still in the garage. His mail piling up in the box. I used my key. They hadn't changed these locks yet, and let myself in. Inside, everything was exactly as my father had left it. The living room with his recliner facing the TV. The kitchen with his coffee mug still in the sink. the bedroom where he'd slept for 40 years of marriage and 10 years of widowhood. And in his bedroom closet, behind a false panel I'd discovered as a child playing hide and seek, was a small floor safe. I'd forgotten about it for years, but standing there, remembering my father's mumbled words about documents and a safe, it came back to me. I even remembered the combination. My mother's birthday, which Dad had never changed. The safe opened easily. Inside were 3 items: a leather-bound journal, a sealed envelope with my name on it in my father's handwriting, and a USB drive. I grabbed all 3 and left, locking the door carefully behind me. Whatever Derek was planning, he didn't need to know about this visit. Back in my car, I opened the envelope first. Inside was a handwritten letter dated 6 months before my father died, before the cancer had robbed him of his clarity. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I fear that things may not have gone according to my wishes. I want you to know that everything I built with Brennan and Sons was meant to be shared equally between you and your brother. Your mother and I always intended for you both to inherit the company together. But I am dying, and I am tired, and Derek has been very insistent about how things should be structured. Denise tells me that having 2 owners will create tax complications and management conflicts. She has shown me documents and projections that suggest the company will be more successful with a single clear leader. I am ashamed to admit that in my weakness, I have considered changing my plans. But I want you to know that whatever the final will says, it does not reflect my true wishes or your true value. I have tried to protect you in other ways. The journal in this safe contains a complete accounting of your contributions to the company. Every hour worked, every crisis managed, every success achieved. I have valued your labor at market rates for a chief financial officer, which is what you have been in all but title. By my calculations, the company owes you approximately $2.8 million in back compensation. The USB drive contains copies of all company financial records, as well as my personal notes about concerning transactions I've noticed over the past several months. I believe Derek may be taking money from the company in ways that aren't proper. I have been too ill to investigate thoroughly, but I wanted you to have this information if you ever needed it. I am sorry, my darling girl, for not being stronger, for not standing up to Derek and Denise when I still had the strength, for allowing you to sacrifice so much for so long without proper recognition. Please know that you were always my partner in this business. You were always enough. You were always valued, even when I failed to show it properly. Make them pay what's owed. Don't let Derek take everything without a fight. All my love, Dad. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. My father had known. He'd tried to protect me. He'd documented everything. $2.8 million, 20 years of unpaid labor, calculated at market rates, written down in his own hand. I opened the journal, page after page of meticulous notes, dates, hours, projects, achievements. My father had been keeping a record of everything I'd done, probably for years. Every late night, every solved crisis, every financial disaster averted. He'd valued it all, priced it all, written it all down. Finally, I plugged the USB drive into my laptop. What I found there was explosive. My father had been more aware than I'd realized. He'd documented numerous suspicious transactions, all of them connected to Derek. Money moving to shell companies. inflated invoices from subcontractors who then kicked back portions to Derek, equipment purchases that had never been delivered, consulting fees paid to companies that didn't exist. My father had been building a case, collecting evidence, maybe planning to confront Derek before he died. But the cancer had moved too fast. Now that evidence was mine, I sat in my car until the sun set, reading through everything: the journal, the financial records, the documented fraud. When I finally started the engine to drive home, I knew exactly what I was going to do. Derek had made a crucial mistake. He'd underestimated me because I'd spent 20 years being quiet, reliable, uncomplaining. He'd assumed that because I'd never demanded my due, I never would. He was about to learn exactly how wrong he was. Tomorrow, I would meet with James Rodriguez, the attorney. I would show him my father's journal, his letter, and the USB drive. I would tell him about the changed will, about my father's diminished capacity at the time of signing, about Derek and Denise's undue influence. And then I would file a claim against the estate for $2.8 million in back wages, not as a gift, not as an inheritance, but as compensation legally owed for services rendered. But that was just the beginning. I would also file a complaint with the district attorney about the fraud I'd discovered, with documentation spanning months, showing a clear pattern of embezzlement and money laundering. Derek had been stealing from the company while my father was dying. Then he'd stolen my inheritance after my father died. He was about to learn that some thefts come with consequences. As I pulled into my driveway, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Powerful. Not angry, not vengeful, just clear-eyed and determined. My father had given me the tools I needed: the evidence, the documentation, the moral authority. Derek thought he'd won by having me escorted out of the office. He thought changing the locks and disabling my email would be enough. But I'd spent 20 years learning every detail of that business. 20 years building relationships with bankers, insurance brokers, suppliers, subcontractors. 20 years earning respect through competence and reliability. Derek had a title on a piece of paper. I had something much more valuable. I had knowledge, evidence, and the determination to use both. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. Just making sure you're not planning to cause any problems. Remember, this is a small industry. Your reputation matters. I smiled as I typed my response. You're absolutely right. Reputation matters tremendously. I'm glad we agree on that. Let him wonder what I meant. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tonight, I would read my father's journal one more time, letting myself feel the validation of knowing that he'd seen my worth, even if he hadn't been strong enough to protect it when it mattered most. Derek had 20 years of embezzlement and fraud to explain. I had 20 years of documented evidence and a rightful claim to what was owed. We would see whose reputation survived this. James Rodriguez's office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, the kind of place that radiated competence without being flashy. When I walked in at 9 a.m. sharp, carrying a leather briefcase containing my father's journal, his letter, the USB drive, and my own meticulously organized files, I felt ready. James was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Emma had told me he'd made a name for himself taking on employment cases that other lawyers considered too complicated or risky. Mrs. Brennan, he said, shaking my hand firmly, Emma spoke highly of you. She said you've been systematically defrauded by your own family. That's one way to put it, I replied, settling into the chair across from his desk. I prefer to think of it as 20 years of wage theft followed by inheritance fraud. His eyebrows rose slightly. Those are strong allegations. Walk me through it. I spent the next 2 hours doing exactly that. I showed him my father's journal with its detailed accounting of my work, the letter explaining his true intentions, the USB drive with evidence of Derek's embezzlement, my own backup files showing every transaction I'd managed, every crisis I'd resolved, every financial decision I'd made that kept the company profitable. James took notes rapidly, occasionally stopping me to ask clarifying questions. When I finished, he sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers. This is remarkable. Your father essentially created an employment contract through his documentation, even if it wasn't formalized. The journal alone establishes a clear pattern of expected compensation. Combined with his letter stating his true intentions for the estate, we have grounds to challenge both the wage theft and the will itself. What about Derek's fraud? I asked. That's actually our strongest card, James said, pulling up some of the files on his computer. This isn't just suspicious transactions. This is systematic embezzlement, false invoicing, money laundering through shell companies. With this evidence, we're not just looking at a civil case. This is criminal. He leaned forward. Here's what I recommend. We file a multi-pronged approach. First, a claim against the estate for back wages based on your father's documentation. Second, a challenge to the will based on undue influence and diminished capacity. Third, we refer the fraud evidence to the district attorney and simultaneously file a civil suit for damages to the company that you have a stake in through your wage claim. How long will this take? Months, possibly over a year. But Margaret, I'll be honest with you. Your brother is going to fight this hard. It's going to get ugly. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the past 20 years, the sacrifices I'd made, the promises my father had broken, not by choice, but by manipulation, the casual cruelty of being escorted out of an office I'd occupied for 2 decades. I've been preparing for this my entire life, I said. I just didn't know it until yesterday. James smiled. Then let's begin. In the first filing hit Derek like a bomb. James sent the wage claim to Richard Moss, the estate attorney, with copies to Derek and his lawyer. The demand was straightforward. $2.8 million in back compensation for 20 years of work as the de facto chief financial officer of Brennan & Sons Construction, supported by comprehensive documentation from the deceased's own records. Derek called me within an hour, his voice shaking with rage. What the hell is this? You're suing Dad's estate? Your own father? I'm claiming what I'm legally owed, I replied calmly. Dad documented everything, Derek. Every hour I worked, every project I managed, every crisis I solved. He calculated it all at market rate for a CFO position. If you have questions, take them up with his attorney. This is insane. You worked there voluntarily. There was no employment agreement. Actually, there was. An implied contract based on repeated promises of future compensation, documented extensively in Dad's personal records. My lawyer assures me the case is quite strong. You can't do this, Derek hissed. The estate doesn't have that kind of liquid cash. You'll bankrupt the company trying to extract some fantasy payday. Then perhaps you should consider a settlement. I suggested. I'm open to negotiations. Through our attorneys, of course. I hung up before he could respond. The second filing came a week later, the challenge to the will. James had compiled medical records showing my father's diminished capacity during his final months, testimony from his oncologist about the effects of his medication, and statements from neighbors who'd witnessed Derek and Denise making frequent visits during the period when Dad was most vulnerable. Combined with the timing, the will had been changed just weeks after Dad's diagnosis became terminal. We had a compelling case for undue influence. Richard Moss called me himself after receiving that filing. Margaret, I want you to know that I had concerns at the time. I documented them in my notes. If you need my testimony about your father's state of mind when he signed that will, I'm willing to provide it. Even though Derek is your client, your father was my client for 30 years. Derek hired me to execute the estate, but my loyalty is to your father's true intentions. And based on everything I knew about him, leaving you with nothing but gratitude doesn't align with the man I knew. It was validation I hadn't expected and deeply needed. The third filing, the referral of fraud evidence to the district attorney, was the one Derek never saw coming. I'd spent a week working with James and a forensic accountant, organizing every piece of evidence from the USB drive and my own backup files. We'd created a timeline showing approximately $150,000 in fraudulent transactions over 18 months, money that Derek had systematically stolen from the company while our father was dying. The forensic accountant had even tracked down some of the shell companies, discovering that they were registered to Denise's maiden name and 2 of her relatives. It was a family operation, stealing from another family business. When the district attorney's office contacted Derek to request an interview, he finally understood the full scope of what he was facing. His attorney called James. My client would like to discuss a settlement of all pending claims. I'm sure he would, James replied. But given the criminal investigation, I'm not sure how much settlement authority we have on that particular matter. Derek's attorney cleared his throat. What would it take to make the criminal referral go away? That's not really how criminal investigations work, James said calmly. Once evidence of fraud is presented to law enforcement, they have an obligation to investigate, regardless of what the victim wants. There was a long silence, but if the victim, Mrs. Brennan, were to express that she felt adequate restitution had been made through civil settlements, the district attorney might take that into consideration, James acknowledged. But we'd be talking about full restitution of the stolen funds, resolution of the wage claim, and a significant revision of the estate distribution. We're not going to let your client steal $2.8 million just because he's willing to pay back the $150,000 he got caught taking. 2 weeks later, I sat across a conference table from Derek and Denise for the first time since he'd had me escorted out of the office. They both looked terrible. Derek had lost weight, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his frame. Denise's usual polished appearance was marred by dark circles under her eyes. Their attorney, a silver-haired man named Paul Hendricks, sat beside them with a stack of documents. James sat next to me, a legal pad in front of him, covered with notes. Let's be clear about where we stand, Paul began. My clients dispute the validity of the wage claim, believing it to be an opportunistic attempt to extract money from a family business following a period of voluntary service. Your clients committed systematic fraud. James interrupted calmly. They stole $150,000 from the company, manipulated a dying man into changing his will, and then illegally terminated Mrs. Brennan's access to company records in an apparent attempt to cover up their theft. We can argue about the wage claim all day, but the fraud is documented, time-stamped, and currently under criminal investigation. Paul's jaw tightened. My clients are prepared to offer a settlement. We're listening, James replied. Paul slid a document across the table. Full restitution of the $150,000 in disputed transactions, plus $50,000 to resolve the wage claim, and an additional $100,000 from the estate settlement. Total package of $300,000 in exchange for Mrs. Brennan dropping all claims and declining to cooperate further with any criminal investigation. I didn't need to look at James to know this was an insult. They were offering me roughly 10% of what I was owed in exchange for letting them off the hook for fraud. No, I said simply. Derek leaned forward. Maggie, be reasonable. The company can't afford. Don't call me Maggie. I cut him off, my voice cold. And don't talk to me about what the company can't afford. I know exactly what that company can afford, because I managed its finances for 20 years, while you were playing golf and stealing from petty cash. Denise's face flushed red. That's not. There's a shell company called Summit Consulting Services registered to your maiden name, I said, looking directly at her. It received $63,000 in consulting fees from Brennan & Sons over the past year. What exactly were you consulting on, Denise? How to commit fraud without getting caught. Because you did a terrible job of that. Paul held up a hand. Mrs. Brennan, we're here to negotiate in good faith. Then negotiate in good faith, James said. Here's our counteroffer. Full restitution of stolen funds, $150,000. Full payment of the wage claim as documented by the deceased, $2.8 million. And transfer of 49% ownership of Brennan & Sons Construction to Mrs. Brennan, reflecting her actual contribution to the company over the past 2 decades. Derek's face went white. You can't be serious. Alternatively, James continued, we proceed with all civil claims, continue cooperating with the criminal investigation, and let a jury decide. I like our odds, but I'm a gambling man. How about you? Paul requested a private consultation with his clients. They huddled in the corner of the conference room, voices rising and falling in heated whispers. I caught fragments. Can't afford that much. Criminal charges. The house isn't worth. Finally, they returned to the table. My clients need time to consider their options, Paul said stiffly. They have 72 hours, James replied. After that, we're filing additional motions, and I'm scheduling a press conference to discuss the case publicly. I'm sure the local business community will be very interested to learn about fraud at one of the city's most established construction companies. Derek's voice was desperate. You'd destroy the company just to get revenge? I looked at him for a long moment. I spent 20 years building that company. You spent 18 months destroying it through fraud and theft. I'm not the one destroying anything, Derek. I'm just the one finally demanding an honest accounting. In the 72 hours pressed, no offer came. True to his word, James held a press conference. He was careful, sticking to documented facts and avoiding any statements that could be considered defamatory. But the facts were damning enough. My client, Margaret Brennan, worked for 20 years as the de facto chief financial officer of Brennan & Sons Construction without compensation, based on repeated promises of future payment. Following the death of her father, the company's founder, she was terminated without notice or severance. Evidence suggests systematic fraud by the new owner, including embezzlement and money laundering through shell companies. We are pursuing full legal remedies. The local business journal picked it up first, then the newspaper, then the local TV news. By the end of the week, Brennan & Sons Construction was under siege. Contractors were calling to verify the company's financial stability. Banks were requesting meetings. The State Contractors Licensing Board announced an investigation. My phone rang constantly. Former employees wanting to share stories about Derek's mismanagement. Suppliers asking if I'd be willing to return to the company if control changed hands. Even competitors offering me positions, CFO roles with real salaries and benefits. One call came from Thomas Chang at the bank. Margaret, I'm required to inform you that given the current legal situation in fraud investigation, First National has frozen Brennan & Sons' line of credit pending resolution. I understand, I said. Off the record, I think your brother is about to discover what happens when you run a construction company without working capital or the person who actually knew how to manage the finances. Spring is the busy season. He's got projects starting, employees to pay, materials to purchase. Without credit and without you, he's going to be in serious trouble within a month. That sounds like a Derek problem, I replied. Just thought you should know. If you were to, say, return to the company under different circumstances, the bank would be very interested in restoring that credit relationship. After we hung up, I allowed myself a small smile. The dominoes were falling exactly as I'd expected. 3 days later, Derek called me directly. Not through his attorney, just him. Maggie, I need help. With what? The business is falling apart. I can't access the credit line. 2 major projects are stalled because suppliers won't deliver materials without payment up front. Payroll is due in 3 days, and I can't figure out the system you use to process it. I need you to come back. To work for free again while you and Denise steal whatever's left. I'll pay you this time, a real salary, whatever market rate is. Just please, come back before everything falls apart. Let me make sure I understand, I said slowly. You kicked me out, called my 20 years of work a family charity, changed all the locks, and told me I had no real value to the company. Now the business is imploding without me, and you want me to come rescue it? Yes, he said, desperation clear in his voice. No, Maggie, please. This is Dad's legacy. Do you want to see everything he built just disappear? Dad's legacy, I repeated. Dad's legacy was documenting my work in a journal and leaving me a letter saying I deserved to be compensated. Dad's legacy was collecting evidence of your fraud because he didn't trust you. If you want to honor Dad's legacy, Derek, settle the lawsuit and give me what I'm owed. I can't. The numbers you're asking for would bankrupt the company. Then sell it, I suggested. Sell Brennan & Sons to someone who actually knows how to run it. Use the proceeds to pay what you owe. Start over with whatever's left. I can't do that. It's my company now. Is it? I asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a company that's about to collapse under the weight of your incompetence. Dad left you the title, Derek, but he left me the knowledge. And knowledge, it turns out, is worth a lot more. I hung up on him for the second time in 2 weeks. That night, Emma came over with takeout and wine. We sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd sat so many times after long days at Brennan and Sons. Too tired to cook, but too wired to sleep. "How are you holding up?" she asked, pouring wine into 2 glasses. "Honestly, better than I expected." I took a sip. I spent so many years thinking I needed that company, that I needed to prove my worth through sacrifice and endless work. But now, watching it fall apart without me, I realize the company needed me far more than I needed it. "Have you thought about what you'll do if you win?" Emma asked. "If you get the settlement you're asking for?" "I've thought about it a lot," I admitted. "Part of me wants to take the money and walk away, start fresh, doing something completely different. But another part," I trailed off, looking at the documents spread across my kitchen table. "Another part thinks about all the employees who've worked there for years, the subcontractors who depend on the company for their livelihoods, the clients who trusted us. They don't deserve to suffer because Derek is a fraud and a thief." "You're thinking about taking over the company," Emma said. It wasn't a question. Maybe, if Derek is forced to sell to pay the settlement, I could be one of the buyers. I know that business inside and out. I have relationships with all the key players. I could rebuild it properly, run it the way Dad actually wanted it run. Emma smiled. "Mom, I think that's exactly what you should do. Show Derek what real leadership looks like." 2 weeks later, the criminal investigation yielded its first results. The district attorney filed formal charges against Derek for embezzlement and fraud. The amount had grown as investigators dug deeper. They'd found an additional $75,000 in suspicious transactions that even I hadn't discovered. Denise was charged as an accomplice, given her role in setting up the shell companies and accepting fraudulent payments. Paul Hendricks called James the day after the charges were filed. "My clients are prepared to accept your settlement terms." James glanced at me. We were in his office, having anticipated this call. I nodded. "All of them?" James asked. "Full restitution, full wage payment, and transfer of 49% ownership? They're requesting a modification. They'll agree to all financial terms, but Derek would like to retain majority ownership." "Denied," I said clearly, leaning forward to the speakerphone. "Tell Derek that if he wants to avoid prison time for fraud, he'll accept our terms exactly as stated. Otherwise, we'll see him in court and let a jury decide how much prison time he deserves." There was a long pause. Then Paul said quietly, "I'll convey that to my clients." The settlement was finalized 3 days later. Derek and Denise would pay full restitution of $225,000 for the documented fraud. The estate would pay me $2.8 million in back wages from the sale of various assets, including my father's house and Derek's personal condo. And most importantly, I would receive 49% ownership of Brennan and Sons Construction. Derek would retain 51% ownership, but with conditions. I would serve as chief financial officer with full authority over all financial decisions, and any major business decisions would require my approval. Essentially, Derek would be a figurehead while I ran the company. In exchange, I agreed to provide a statement to the district attorney indicating that I felt adequate restitution had been made and didn't wish to pursue further criminal penalties. Given that Derek and Denise agreed to plead guilty to reduced charges of financial fraud and accept probation plus community service, the DA was willing to proceed without my testimony. The day I signed the settlement agreement, I felt an unexpected emotion. Not triumph, but relief. Relief that the fight was over. Relief that justice had been served. Relief that my father's true intentions had finally been honored. 6 months after being escorted out of Brennan and Sons Construction, I walked back in through the front door, not as an unpaid volunteer, not as the invisible workhorse, but as the chief financial officer and 49% owner. The employees stood and applauded as I entered. These were people I'd worked alongside for years, who'd watched me build this company while Derek took credit, and I took nothing. Derek was already there, sitting in what had been my father's office. He looked diminished, defeated. The criminal charges, even though reduced, had taken their toll. He'd made the local news, not as the successful heir to a construction empire, but as a white-collar criminal who'd stolen from his own family business. "I've prepared an office for you," he said stiffly. "Corner space, south-facing windows. You'll have full access to all financial systems immediately." "Thank you," I replied, equally formal. We stood there awkwardly for a moment. Brothers and sisters who'd grown up together, now essentially business adversaries, forced into partnership by my lawsuit and his crimes. "I suppose you're going to make my life hell now," Derek said finally. I looked at him, really looked at him. At 45, he seemed older, worn down by consequences he'd never imagined facing. Part of me, the part that remembered childhood games and family holidays, felt a twinge of sympathy, but mostly I felt nothing. "No, Derek, I'm going to make this company profitable. I'm going to restore the reputation Dad spent 40 years building. I'm going to take care of the employees who depend on us for their livelihoods. What happens to you personally is entirely up to you." I walked past him into my new office. South-facing windows, a large desk, updated computer equipment. Everything I should have had 20 years ago. My first order of business was a staff meeting. I gathered everyone in the conference room, all 43 employees, from senior project managers to the receptionist who'd worked there almost as long as I had. "I want to be clear about something," I began. "This company almost collapsed because of financial mismanagement and fraud. That's over now. Moving forward, we're going to operate with complete transparency and integrity. If you have questions about finances, ask. If you see something concerning, report it. We're going to rebuild trust, starting today." Sarah Martinez, our senior project manager, raised her hand. "Margaret, what's going to happen with the projects that stalled? We've got 3 major builds that stopped mid-construction when the credit line was frozen. I met with the bank yesterday. Our credit line is being restored, effective immediately. Materials will be delivered starting tomorrow. We'll work overtime, if necessary, to get back on schedule. The clients have been incredibly patient, largely because of relationships this company built over decades. We're not going to let them down." The relief in the room was palpable. Over the next few months, I worked systematically to repair the damage Derek had done. I renegotiated payment terms with suppliers who'd been burned by late payments. I personally called every client to assure them that Brennan and Sons was under new financial management and fully operational. I implemented new oversight procedures to prevent fraud. Most importantly, I hired a full accounting staff, real employees with real salaries, people who would never work for 20 years unpaid, who would never be taken advantage of the way I had been. Derek showed up occasionally, attended the required meetings, signed the documents I put in front of him, but increasingly, he was absent. His heart wasn't in it anymore, and everyone knew it. 8 months into our new arrangement, Derek came to my office with a proposal. I want to sell you my 51%. I looked up from the spreadsheet I'd been reviewing. Why? Because I hate this, he said bluntly. I hate coming here. Hate being the guy everyone knows committed fraud. Hate answering to you on every decision. This was supposed to be my inheritance, my chance to prove I could run something successfully. Instead, it's just a constant reminder of how badly I screwed up. And Denise, divorced. She left when the money ran out and the criminal charges hit. Turns out she was more interested in the construction company owner than in me personally. I felt that twinge of sympathy again, slightly stronger this time. Derek had lost everything: his wife, his reputation, his position in the community. The fraud charges would follow him forever. How much? I asked. He named a figure. It was fair, based on the current valuation of the company. Lower than it would have been before his fraud destroyed the company's reputation, but reasonable given current circumstances. I'll have my attorney draw up the papers, I said. 3 weeks later, I signed the final documents, making me the sole owner of Brennan and Sons Construction, the company my grandfather started, the company my father built, the company I'd kept alive for 20 years, without recognition or compensation. Finally, it was truly mine. I stood in the office after everyone had gone home, looking at the framed photo of my grandfather from 1962, standing in front of a single truck with Brennan and Sons painted on the side. Next to it was a photo of my father from the 1990s, standing in front of a fleet of trucks and a team of employees. I added a third photo to the wall, me, standing in front of our current fleet, with our full team of employees behind me, 3 generations of Brennans. And now, finally, I was getting the recognition I deserved. My phone buzzed. Emma. Mom, did you finalize the purchase? Just finished. I'm the sole owner as of today. I'm so proud of you, she said, and I could hear the emotion in her voice. You fought for what you deserved, and you won. It wasn't about winning, I replied, surprising myself with the realization. It was about fairness, about finally demanding to be valued for the work I actually did. After we hung up, I walked through the empty office one more time, past the cubicles where our accounting staff worked, past the conference room where we met with clients, past the break room where employees gathered for lunch. This wasn't just a building or a business. It was a legacy. My grandfather's legacy, my father's legacy, and now mine. Derek had tried to take it all, and he'd lost everything in the process. Not because I destroyed him, but because his own choices, the fraud, the theft, the willingness to betray family for money, had consequences he couldn't escape. Meanwhile, I demanded accountability and received justice. My father had tried to protect me through his documentation and his letter. The legal system had honored his intentions and my contributions. I wasn't the quiet, invisible daughter anymore. I wasn't the one who sacrificed endlessly for others' benefit. I was the woman who'd built a multi-million-dollar company, demanded her due, and now stood at the helm of an empire she'd earned. 1 year after Derek escorted me out of the office, Brennan and Sons Construction was thriving. Revenue was up 32%. We'd hired 15 new employees. We'd landed contracts with 3 major developers who'd previously worked with competitors. I was featured in the local business journal with the headline, "From Invisible to Invincible: How Margaret Brennan Took Back Her Family Business." The article detailed my story: 20 years of unpaid labor, the fraudulent will, Derek's embezzlement, and my legal battle to claim what was rightfully mine. It presented me not as a victim, but as a strategic fighter who'd used documentation, legal leverage, and business acumen to achieve justice. I framed a copy and hung it in my office, next to the photos of my grandfather and father. My mother called after the article came out. She'd been mostly absent during the legal battle, uncomfortable with the conflict between her children. Now she sounded proud. "I always knew you were stronger than people gave you credit for," she said. "Dad knew too," I replied. "He documented it all. He tried to protect me, even when he was too weak to do it directly." "I'm sorry I didn't fight harder for you when he was changing the will," she said quietly. "Derek was so insistent, and I thought maybe he was right about the tax implications and management structure. I should have questioned it more. It's okay, Mom. In a strange way, this turned out better. If Dad had split the company 50-50, Derek and I would have been fighting over every decision for years. This way, I have full control, and the company is better for it." As we talked, I realized I'd forgiven her, not because she deserved it particularly, but because holding on to anger was exhausting, and I had better things to do with my energy. Derek had moved to another state, working at a friend's landscaping business. We didn't speak. Maybe someday we would, but for now, the distance felt necessary and right. Emma had joined the company part-time, working in project management while finishing her MBA. Watching her learn the business, I felt a sense of completion. This legacy would continue, but on better terms. Emma would never work 20 years unpaid. She would never be invisible or undervalued. The lessons I had learned about demanding fair compensation, about documenting everything, about not accepting promises as substitutes for concrete action, those lessons I would pass down intentionally. On the anniversary of the day Derek had me escorted out, I gathered the entire staff for a celebration, not to commemorate my humiliation, but to mark how far we'd come in 12 months. 1 year ago, this company was in crisis, I began. Financial fraud, frozen credit, stalled projects, uncertain future. Today, we're not just surviving, we're thriving. Revenue is up, reputation is restored. We're bidding on projects we wouldn't have been considered for a year ago. I paused, looking around at faces I'd known for years, and new faces who'd joined during our rebuilding. This success belongs to all of us. Every person in this room has contributed to bringing this company back from the brink. You stayed when you could have left. You believed when others doubted. You worked hard when the easy choice would have been to give up. Sarah Martinez started the applause. Within seconds, everyone was standing, clapping not for me, but for our collective achievement. Later, in the quiet of my office, I opened my father's journal one more time. I'd read it so often, I'd memorized large sections. But I still found comfort in seeing his handwriting, his careful documentation of my contributions. On the last page, he'd written something I'd missed during my first readings. words that had been hidden by a coffee stain. Margaret has been the true heart of this company for 20 years. When I'm gone, I hope she finds the courage to claim what she's earned. She has always been enough. She has always been more than enough. My only regret is not telling her that more often while I was alive. Tears blurred my vision as I read those words again. My father had seen me. He'd valued me. He'd tried, in his final months, to protect me from the consequences of his own weakness in the face of Derek's manipulation. His documentation, his letter, his evidence, those were his final gift to me. Not just the company, not just the money, but proof that I had mattered, that my work had value, that I deserved recognition. I closed the journal and placed it in the safe in my office, next to the updated company bylaws that listed me as sole owner and CEO. 20 years I'd worked in silence, accepting scraps of appreciation while others took credit for my achievements. 20 years I'd believed that dedication and sacrifice would eventually be rewarded. I'd been right about the reward, but wrong about how it would come. It hadn't come as a gift from grateful family. It had come because I'd finally demanded it, fought for it, and refused to accept anything less. Derek had tried to write me out of the story. Instead, he'd forced me to write my own ending. And this ending, standing in my own office, running my own company, finally receiving the recognition I'd earned, was better than anything I could have imagined during those quiet, invisible years. Some people might have called it revenge, taking down my brother, forcing him to sell, ending up with everything while he lost it all. But it wasn't revenge. It was justice. It was accountability. It was simply, finally, getting what I'd earned. And there was something deeply satisfying about that. Not the satisfaction of destroying an enemy, but the satisfaction of being valued correctly, of having my contributions recognized, of no longer being invisible. I'd spent 20 years being the quiet one, the reliable one, the one who could be taken for granted. Never again. As I turned off the lights and locked the office door, my office, my company, my legacy, I thought about all the women like me, the ones who work without recognition, who sacrifice without appreciation, who give and give and give because they believe that's what family requires. To them, I wanted to say, document everything, know your worth, demand fair compensation. Don't accept promises as substitutes for concrete action. And if you're forced to fight for what you've earned, fight without apology, because you are enough. You have always been enough. And sometimes, the only way to make others see that is to show them the price of underestimating you.